Hello everyone, and welcome to 1000 Conversations about Mental Health. We have a great show for you today. We are going to talk about giftedness. And that's when you have a child, or maybe it's an adult who has just been recently diagnosed as being gifted. But we're going to talk about giftedness because you've all heard it. You've heard this term because it seems like it's somewhat of a new term that we hear as parents. But we're going to talk about what that means. Does it exist? What are some of the fallacies, some of the misconceptions about giftedness? And our guest today is an expert in this field, is Theresa Andare. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Theresa is a clinical psychologist, and I think it's fair to say you have a specialty in giftedness?
Yeah, it sort of developed itself, but I do a lot of assessments for giftedness and work with a lot of gifted children and adults in practice. So
let's talk about what assessment means for giftedness.
Sure.
So that means there is a test to see if someone's gifted?
Yeah, there are actually several tests. There are two that are primarily used, the Wechsler assessments and the Stanford-Binet. I use the Wechsler assessments, and within the Wechslers there are three different assessments, one for preschool age children, one for school age children, and then one for adults.
Okay, and is this going to give you an IQ score?
Yes.
Or does it give you more than that sometimes?
It gives us several scores. The tests vary slightly. For example, the younger test for the preschool age children gives us less scaled scores than these tests for the school age children or the adults. But basically what we're going to get out of that test is the full scale score, which is generally what someone would think of as an IQ score.
Okay.
And then we will also get subtest scores of a verbal score, perceptual reasoning, processing speed, and working memory.
So let's talk about this for a minute, because if we use IQ scores as a measurement of who is gifted and who is in a normal range or who is below a normal range, and that's usually what we use. That's the standard
Certainly,
benchmark,
yes.
is an IQ
Yes.
score. So if we go into a normal range, we're talking what range is normal?
Well, if we look at the distribution of IQ scores, we would see a typical bell curve assessment or bell curve distribution. And so our center would be 100, which would be considered average.
So that would be the average population. We'll say the majority is going to be around the 100 mark.
Yeah, they usually would fall, we would hope, between 80 to 110.
80 to 110,
Yeah.
okay. And then what if we have below 80? Are we talking about someone who has some deficiencies in some learning
Yeah, we
some of
would
the
see
processes?
some cognitive limitations generally below 80.
Okay, so when we're talking giftedness, we're talking above 120 or 130. I mean, it's kind of, where do you put the line?
Sure, there is some controversy to say about where do we draw the line. Generally speaking, 130 is a pretty standard number. However, a lot of gifted programs will look at kids from 120 or so, sometimes 115, depending on the program.
Okay.
So I often tell parents when they bring their children in that we're usually looking to see around 120 and above as a full-scale score.
Right. And so this is so interesting because there are some people who are going to question this in our program today and say, what does it matter?
Certainly. And to some people, it doesn't matter at all. I mean, they just have no interest in knowing it, or it just isn't relevant to them. However, I think it is relevant to know because it gives you information about yourself or about your child, which can be valuable in terms of their learning abilities, their ways of learning, their strengths and weaknesses. Because the reality is that even when these children are very high functioning intellectually, they can struggle with functioning in other areas, which can be very applicable in a lot of ways and very important.
So if someone, tell me the parents that come to you, what is the motivating or the factor, what is the incident, the inciting incident
Sure.
that makes a parent say, we need to get our child tested?
Most often it is a child who is bored in school. They just seem to not be working to their full potential. They oftentimes might be getting in trouble at school, because sometimes I'll see kids, the parents will say, oh, well, they get done and they start doing other children's work, or they want to know, why do we have to do this? They'll ask a lot of questions instead of just doing whatever they're given. Sometimes they may not even be getting that great of grades in school, but the parents just say, I think they could do more. I just don't think that this curriculum is working for them. I think there's more going on than we're seeing.
So there is a lot, not a lot. There is many times that the parent is saying that the child's having trouble in school.
Often, yes.
Okay. And so that might be an inciting incident there
Sure.
to say, what's going on?
Sure.
We need to get some answers
Sure.
here as to what's going
And
on.
oftentimes they may be doing well technically in school, but come home and complain about school, say that they're bored, or the parent might see that the child just doesn't seem to really have to work very hard or be very engaged in school.
And I'm wondering, do you get parents that say things like, well, they're so smart at home, they do all of this stuff at home, but at school they just don't seem to want to do it?
Definitely.
Do you get that contrast
There's
of at home?
often a dichotomy between what the parents see and the teachers will see, and so that can be a reason for assessment too. The parents are saying, I know that they're capable of this, I see this at home, and we just don't see it at school.
Right, right. Okay, so why, I think we need to explain to our audience why this topic of giftedness, because I think a lot of people would say, well, my gosh, you're such a lucky parent, you have such a brilliant child.
Sure.
So why would we be talking about this when we're talking on a show about mental health issues? Why do we say that giftedness is a mental health issue?
It's a pretty
or could be
in-depth question, but I think that that is one of the misconceptions, that this is a lucky thing, how fortunate, how wonderful. And I'll often tell parents, well, this is the good news and the bad news. Your child is very smart. These children are often more intense in a lot of ways, and so that can be, again, a wonderful thing and a very challenging thing. What that can mean is that not only do they understand things intellectually on a certain level, but they understand them in a very complex way that often exceeds their developmental capabilities.
And let's break this down a little bit. So what you're saying is that maybe they understand things at a, maybe they're 8 years old and they understand things at a 15 or 16-year-old level.
Exactly.
But they're still only 8.
Exactly.
So this could be a problem for the child to have to deal with.
Right.
Because that might get some internal conflict going.
Exactly.
I'm only 7, but the world seems very big,
Sure.
and the world seems kind of scary,
Sure.
and there's a lot of things that I can't do anything
Yep.
about.
And these children will often have very intense interests. So along that same line, they may be interested in topics that most high schoolers or college students or adults even would be interested in: politics, world events, things like that. And yet they are only maybe 8 years old, and it's difficult for them to emotionally grasp and process these things. And so I do see a lot of gifted children who become anxious because they just can't seem to turn that incredibly powerful brain off.
Right.
And they just think about everything, and they worry about things, and they want to know why, and they want to understand. And that can be a difficult thing. Along those lines, then they can also be more prone to being depressed.
Mm-hmm. And so, and as our audience probably, unless they're just joining us, depression is a mental illness.
Sure.
Anxiety is a mental illness.
Sure.
We do have some, it's not a comorbidity, but with giftedness, they have a higher chance of having some of these problems.
Yeah. And what that means is that being gifted doesn't necessarily mean, like you said, the comorbidity of we see a higher incidence of then diagnostic criteria that would fit a child into a diagnosis of major depression or generalized anxiety, for example.
Right.
However, we will see that they may be more prone to being anxious or to being depressed. They may not necessarily then, we may not say they're being diagnosed as depressed, but the way that their mind thinks may lead them to feel more down, more anxious, more worried, which can then create a slippery slope. And we can see that down the line, if left untreated, unrecognized, unacknowledged, they may then fall into a diagnostic criteria.
And I think that's a really important point, because for parents out there who have children who are intense, and it's so interesting because giftedness doesn't always mean intellectually gifted.
Right.
So, because a lot of people think, well, if they can do physics when they're 4 years old, that means gifted.
Sure.
But there's a lot of different types of giftedness.
Yes.
So it's not only can they do calculus, or if they can do calculus, but are they gifted musically?
Right.
Are they gifted artistically in some way? And I have a daughter, as you know, I have a daughter who's gifted, and her giftedness comes out in artistically, emotionally, and intellectually. I mean, she's got some pretty strong characteristics going on together. So this is a topic that interests me greatly as well. But I think it's important that parents know that if you have a child that's gifted, it is incumbent upon the parents to make sure that we do keep our kids mentally healthy so that when they're 15 and 16, that they don't get the anxiety going so much that they reach to a substance abuse, or dropping out of school because they're bored, or just trying to find something to calm down that brain of theirs.
Definitely. And I do see that in practice, where there are children who reach that high school age or the middle school age where they're so concerned with fitting in with their peers and just being normal, and their brains just don't work in a normal way, and so they find ways to bring themselves down to that level, and it can often be through substance abuse or just through downplaying their many abilities, which can then lead them to struggle academically or start hanging out with kids who just don't have the same values about education as they once did.
So pretending they're not as smart as they really are.
Definitely. And that can then create some inner conflict for children because they recognize that they're capable and they're not performing to those abilities, and then they begin to struggle on some level internally about that.
Right. So what would you tell a parent that has someone that they think they might have a child that's gifted? And I'll tell you, because as a parent myself of a gifted child, I was the very last person to buy into this.
Sure.
I was the very last person. I said, come on, every parent thinks their child is brilliant. Every parent thinks their child is the be-all, the end-all. And people would say, she's different. She's different, she's different, she's gifted, she's this, she's that. And I'd go, no. And it wasn't until I read a list of qualities and characteristics of gifted children, and I said, oh my goodness, this is my little girl.
Sure.
So what would you tell a parent that wonders?
Well, I think it is difficult for parents to have perspective sometimes. I didn't really believe that until I was a parent myself. I have kids come in for assessments all the time, and the parents will say, well, you know, everyone tells me they're smart, and of course I think they're smart, they're my child, but I don't know. I don't know what I think about this. And then these children would seem to inevitably score off the charts. And I would think, how do you not know
How
that?
did you miss this? How could you not know this?
But the reality is, I think, as a parent, you just come to know your child as what you know.
That's right.
And even if you have other children, it's all within that family unit, and it just becomes your normal.
Right.
And so it often is helpful when you have outside information, whether it's from friends or neighbors or other family members, teachers, and checklists like that. So my sort of suggestion then to parents would be that if there is anyone or any sort of inkling that your child may be gifted, that it's worth investigating because it provides information for you that can be valuable.
And I'll tell you, for our audience, you can go on the internet and just type in gifted characteristics or gifted child characteristics, and it's really helpful.
Yes.
With my daughter, she was in preschool, and she would cry every morning and say, please don't take me there, please don't take me there, please don't take me there. And it was every morning. And I would investigate at the preschool, and I'd say, is someone picking on her? Is she bored? I didn't say is she bored. I said, is someone picking on her? Is someone being mean to her? What is she doing during her day? And the preschool teacher said, no one's picking on her. So as a good mom, I spied. And I stayed after I dropped off. I stayed later and I spied. And what I saw was that she withdrew, and what happened over a period of time is that my bubbling, exciting, charismatic daughter stopped dancing, stopped singing, cried every morning, lost the joy in her life, and I was terrified. And so I ended up putting her into a gifted program, and within 24 hours of being in the gifted program, she woke up the next morning and said, "Come on, Mama, we can't be late. We have to get to school right now." As a parent, you say, "Oh my gosh, this is, I will keep my child here forever," because
Sure.
I saw that turnaround in my child, and she started dancing, and she started singing, and she started smiling and being all of those I got my daughter back.
Yeah.
So it was a matter of, it was pretty dramatic. And you and I have talked about this before, about the kids in school who aren't doing well, who are maybe causing problems, maybe acting out, that maybe this is a problem that maybe they're more than likely not a bad kid.
Right.
They're more than likely a bored kid.
Sure.
Or that there's something going on there
Sure.
that's stopping this child
Definitely.
from excelling.
Definitely.
So it's just an interesting thing to have gone through it myself.
Sure.
And so I'm always looking and learning and trying to find out more about giftedness.
Well, and this is why I often suggest to parents that they find out, because the information is very powerful. Unfortunately, a lot of public school districts have cut their gifted program because they just don't have funding for them. And the mentality in a lot of districts, or just amongst a lot of people, has been these children will do fine on their own. They don't need the help. They don't need the services. Those are the smart kids. Those are the good kids. They'll be fine. And unfortunately, this is not always the case. And with increased emphasis on testing in schools, there's not as much room for teachers to individualize the curriculum for students who may be bored. And so I've had parents who've really found assessment or just knowing that their child was gifted very helpful, because they've been able to go to their teachers, their principals, and say, "This is what I know about my child, and this is what they need, and they need to be challenged, or these are their strengths and these are their weaknesses. These are the ways that they learn." And by understanding that, the teachers, principals, whoever interacts with this child is then better able to work with them and reach them.
I want to talk about something that, first of all, it is horrible that the gifted programs are being cut. Okay, because that is a fallacy to say that these kids will make it on their own. Sometimes these kids have such capabilities that they don't know how to manage at times. So they do learn differently, and they do need specialized care. So we were talking earlier, and you said when you tell a parent that their child is gifted, that it's a good news, bad news situation. So, and how did you explain what you would tell the parent, why it's good news, why it's a bad news?
Well, I think it's good news because it's always wonderful to hear that our children are bright, are smart. Right. Everyone wants that for their children. But the bad news about it is it makes them different in a way that anything else would make them different. One of the things that we had discussed previously is when we look at that bell curve distribution of intelligence, we see that most people fall in this middle 50 or so percent. And in schools, we don't question at all that we would give services to the lower end of the spectrum, and rightfully so. Those children need those services to succeed. However, we've developed this attitude that we don't need to then provide services to the upper end of the spectrum. And so I think that that's sort of the bad news, is that here are children that are exceptional in a way that isn't always recognized, that isn't always then helped and provided services. And it is important for them to have those services. It is important for us to recognize that there are learning differences for these children, and that they will need help of some sort.
So for someone who's gifted, they could be gifted in different areas. Doesn't mean they're gifted across the board.
That's very true.
Okay, so they may be gifted musically. It doesn't mean they'll be gifted mathematically.
Sure.
Although mathematics and music sometimes go together. So they could. That was a bad example. So they could be gifted design-wise, artistically, maybe in another field, but maybe they're reading. Maybe they're not big readers.
Sure. Sure.
You know, maybe the written word is not their thing. So I think that's important to get that out there. So learning differently. I see kids who are gifted, and it is so evident that they need to have different structure. They need to have more individualized attention, because maybe they need to give their presentations by building a model, because they're mechanically inclined, their brain works that way. So they need to, if the subject matter is tell me about Washington, D.C., they need to build models of structures in Washington, D.C., whereas there's another child who may need to write an essay about Washington, D.C., and yet another child will make a song to discuss Washington, D.C.
Sure.
You know, so I think that's some of the ways I want our audience to realize of what we're talking about when we say different ways of learning. What are some other different ways of learning for gifted kids?
Well, you've covered a lot of them. I mean, I think that what's important to recognize is that it's not necessarily just gifted children, but there is more and more recognition of this idea that some of us learn through doing, some of us learn through hearing, some of us learn through seeing, and that these are things that by accessing and paying attention to in the classroom, we can allow students to work on the same type of project in different ways that appeal to them. And sometimes it's not even making the change in the classroom as much as it is helping the child or the parents to be aware that this is what you need. And so a student, for example, who knows I need to see something may be able to then advocate for themselves and say to a teacher, I need to see that. Can you write it down for me? Yes, exactly.
Because I'm a visual learner.
Exactly.
I need to sit in the front row. Right. Can you show that to me? Can I get extra slides later on?
Exactly.
To have the visual with me.
Sure.
So it's about being an advocate, isn't it?
It is. And so that is an important part of having the knowledge, is the ability to advocate. I had a parent who had brought their son to me a few years ago, and he scored exceptionally well. And they were really having a lot of difficulty in their local public school. And she herself had gone through a gifted program, and they were looking at a similar program. And I ran into her a year or so later, and she said, oh, I'm so glad we did that assessment, because we actually kept him where he was at, but we went to the principal and said, this is what's going on with him. This is what he needs. What can you do? Can you help us? Can you work with us? And by having that information, she was able to go in and advocate for her child, give him the ability to advocate for himself, give him the information to say, no, you really are very bright and you are very capable. And he had a total turnaround in the same school the next year. And it was wonderful.
Isn't that great? Because one of the things that I want to talk about too is that there are gifted children who make it just fine in public schools.
Definitely. And that is often an area that I discuss with parents that is a bit of a struggle, because it can be very costly to take their children out of the local public school and put them in a gifted program.
Right.
The programs are limited in number and they're very high in cost. They're a wonderful option. I highly recommend them, but they're not the option for every parent. And unfortunately, our options are now more limited in the local public schools. So it really does then require you as a parent to have the information and advocate for your child and help your child learn to then advocate for themselves.
Okay, so here's the question that I ask all of my guests. If you had a magic wand and you could change one thing that people do or don't do or think or don't think when it comes to giftedness, what would it be?
Wow. I've thought about what I would answer for this question, but I'm not really sure. I think that one of the things is just that I would change this perception that all of these children are these super geniuses who can accomplish all these things, that are doing calculus at 5 years old, because that really isn't the reality. And they very often, more often than not, are just normal children who want to be treated like normal children. They have interests that might not really seem normal, but underneath it all, they are just a 5-year-old who wants to play with friends and have fun and be a normal kid and feel good about themselves. And I think that that's an important thing for people to understand.
So if you have a gifted child, you're not treating them like an adult, even though they may be thinking
Sure.
like an adult. You have to remember that they're a child.
It's about balance. You know, you have to be able to recognize that their capabilities are in some ways beyond what a typical 5-year-old is capable of, but at the same time recognize that they still need limits and boundaries and love and attention, just like a normal 5-year-old, that they can't always understand everything at the level they would like you to think they could understand it.
Oh my goodness. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Theresa Andare, clinical psychologist. If someone wants to get testing, can they call you, or do you have a website?
Sure.
Or
Probably the easiest way generally to reach me is by email at Theresa, it's Theresa, and then Andare, Andare, at gmail.com, or by telephone. And my number is 248-320-5590.
And we'll put that on the after the show. We can run that so that you can, if you want to get in touch with Theresa, either for clinical services.
Sure.
Okay, clinical service. Bring your child in for an assessment. She is a friend that I've known for a while, and she's done great work. Continue your great work. Continue your success. Thank you so much for being here. I think we've helped a lot of people.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in today. I hope you've learned something about giftedness and gifted children. If you need some more information, we will run some afterward, after the show, and tune in next month for another edition of 1000 Conversations about Mental Health.